Hello, welcome to Critical Conversations number 11. I'm Carl Raschke, Professor of Philosophy of Religion at the University of Denver and the Executive Editor for the New Polis, one of the Whitestone Publications. Our guest for today is Eric Kaufmann, Professor of Politics at Birkbeck College at the University of London. He's the author of a book entitled Whiteshift, Population Immigration and the Future of White Majorities, published by Penguin in 2019. And I have to say, this book has been getting a lot of international attention in recent months and perhaps in recent years. His other books include Shall the Religious Inherit the Earth?, The Rise and Fall of Anglo-America, The Orange Order, and Unionism and Orangism in Northern Ireland since 1945. He's the co-editor, among others, of the journal Political Demography and of a monograph, Whither the Child, Causes and Consequences of Low Fertility. He's also the editor of Rethinking Ethnicity, Majority Groups and Dominant Minorities. An editor of the journal Nations and Nationalism, he has written for the New York Times, Times of London, Financial Times, Newsweek International, Foreign Policy, and Prospect magazines. Welcome, Dr. Kaufmann.
Thanks very much, Carl. Yeah, and I should say I am on the West Coast, but I'm a bit north of California. I'm in Vancouver, but Canada.
Oh,
but
okay.
anyway, yeah. So thanks for having me on, and I'm mainly going to just let you guys sort of ask away, but I'll just sort of say something about the book, which is that it's both sort of a mix of historical but mainly survey-based research, and the argument is really that. It's in the context of the demographic decline of white majorities as a share of their national populations that we have to understand the upsurge in populism in Western countries, in Europe and to some extent North America. That if you actually look at what predicts somebody voting for a populist right party in Europe, for example, by far and away the strongest predictor is attitudes to immigration and also how highly people rank immigration as an issue compared to, say, healthcare and the economy and so on. And in a way, immigration is kind of the lightning rod because of these cultural concerns. And if you look at how people arrive at their immigration attitudes, the cultural considerations and the psychological considerations are much more highly correlated than anything economic. So that's sort of the first part of the book, and I look very much at the demographic trends. So for example, the decline of white majorities in the US and then also Canada, New Zealand, dropping around below about 50% of the population around 2050, with all the caveats, of course, which I get into later in the book around boundary expansion of the meaning of the term white. And then that's largely setting the stage in part one. I look across Europe, I look at the US, mainly looking at election studies, public opinion data, demographic trends. And then that's sort of Whiteshift 1.0. And then the second part of the book, which is the Whiteshift 2.0, which is somewhat more speculative, but based on demographic patterns of interracial marriage and sort of suggesting that if we look ahead, by the time we get into next century, we're going to see the emergence of mixed race majorities. And so the argument there was that the meaning of that they will tend to trace their ancestry and cultural roots back to the existing white majorities in most cases. And so that was, and it's a pattern we've seen through history. Many groups such as the Turks and Hungarians have absorbed large numbers of other groups and they've become melting pots, and then yet you get an integration of these groups into the dominant storyline. So yeah, that's sort of the Whiteshift 2.0, if you like, the emergence of a kind of multiracial whiteness that is going to come in next century, but in our lifetimes, that's not going to be in evidence so much. It's going to be much more the story, I think, of populist responses to these quite significant ethno-demographic shifts, and symbolized around the sort of battleground issue of immigration, and that's sort of I think the conditions that have led to that are not going to abate. And so I think, yes, we've had COVID and that's dampened down some of these forces, but I think they're going to be coming back once the planes start flying in earnest again. So that would be sort of, that's it from me. And I'll just open it up to you guys. I can go into further details as needed.
Okay, great. Yeah, that's what I said. We'll just have a kind of free-ranging conversation. So I want to quote you what you say in your opening paragraph or in chapter 1. He says, "We need to talk about white identity, not as a fabrication designed to maintain power, but as a set of myths and symbols to which people are attached. An ethnic identity like any. The big question of our time is less what does it mean to be an American than what does it mean to be a white American in an age of ethnic change. The progressive storyline for white majorities is a morality tale, celebrating the demise, and as I hope to show, much of today's populist reaction stems directly or indirectly from this trope." Now, this is very provocative, and it resonates a lot with my own thinking and research. Our MA program here, of which we have a number of our students and who are part of our editorial team, have been looking into the whole question.
Your route is clear. You will arrive at 10:38.
We got background noise here. I think we're.
Yeah, just mute. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Mute that one as well.
Please, can you guys please mute yourself? Everybody, thank you. You talk about this as a trope. And one of the things we've been doing in our research team is we've been looking at actual history, which as a historian, not officially one, but someone who takes history much more seriously than most people on the theoretical side like myself do, I've been emphasizing how so much of these countervailing narratives and what are sometimes popularly called the culture wars and the discourse that goes along with them are totally ignorant of history. And I think one of the things that's most unsettling, and I say that in a good way about your book, Eric, is that you actually have history and data to back up what you're saying. And you don't really, in a sense, fit in with a particular narrative, which it seems everybody wants their preferred narrative without critically examining what's going on here. So, you know, in America, I don't think it's taken root so much in Europe, especially since the protests over the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis and all the kind of political upheaval that caused. The narrative has been that we have this dominant regime in America that has been around really, you know, since, you know, 1492, and it's getting stronger and it's becoming kind of a hegemon that we call whiteness, whatever that means. And whiteness becomes the kind of touchstone against which everybody and everything sort of gets measured. And what you really try to show is that in itself, to use the words, it's not quite right here, a trope. So I'm wondering if you could make some comments here in terms of the data that you've come up with, and you know that sort of stuff. Sometimes it's hard, I think, for the average person to assimilate Whiteshift because it's so rich and full of data, and you know you make points. It's like this is what the data shows. This is what actually happened in history. This is, you know, these is how these groups developed and so forth. And you also challenge some of the kind of academic narratives that have wended their way into the popular discourse. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the trope and kind of the odyssey of this trope in contemporary popular thinking, especially the discussions about race, and you know, do you think we need to come to terms with these in terms of how we talk about this issue in the academic world as well as in the media and the press and around our dinner table?
Well, yeah, I think that's right. I think the key to all this is this idea of whiteness as a power structure, which is something I'm quite critical of. It's not to say there isn't a power dimension, but essentially anyone who researches this topic tends to, they tend to use the term whiteness as a political term, ignoring, for example, whether or not there's a sociological ethnic group there that has attachment to myths, symbols, and memories and culture, right? So, these are different perspectives in ethnic studies anyway, where some see ethnic groups as merely political constructions designed to further the interests of elite groups, and others see ethnic groups as, in fact, that people are attached to particular myths, symbols, and memories, and that is really what is behind ethnicity. And that's sort of closer to the way. I'm not discounting that power can come into it and elites have some impact, but I'm more on the side of seeing these things as deeply rooted, effective attachments in populations that are reproduced over time. And so from that perspective, if you take a group like white America, now, of course, this was more narrowly restricted to Protestants in the past, and then through assimilation, by the time we get into the 1970s and 80s, it's including Catholics and Jews. A lot of the sort of critical race theory writers, and some of whom are quite interesting, but it's a theory, and I don't think it holds up that well. One of their arguments is that the white group expanded its boundaries instrumentally to try and maintain power and domination in some way. And I think Richard Alba, the sociologist, has an interesting book out. And I'm trying to remember something. I can't remember it. I can't remember the exact title, and I should know this, but I can't remember it. But anyway, he sort of says, well, how can it be the case in the 60s when, whites were demographically so dominant? They had no need whatsoever. The WASPs, if you like, had no need whatsoever to expand their boundaries to include Catholics and Jews. This makes no sense. And if you actually look at it, what was happening was you had upward mobility of Catholics and Jews in the labor force and increasing geographic mobility. And that really is what drives the whole process, not some cynical desire to keep non-white people out of a power structure. So this whole conspiratorial neo-Marxist, which is fine. That's a way of analyzing the world through elite interests and conspiracy and instrumental action. I just think that's not well borne out in the history. And so instead, what we have are sociological entities, and it's really about subjective belief in common descent and myths and memories and cultural differentiae that really is the sort of guts of ethnicity, if you like. And yeah, this is an ethnic group like any other. It has its interests like any other. My view is that essentially should be analyzed as a group like any other. What we of course have is also a situation of what I call asymmetrical multiculturalism, where ethnic groups that are minorities are essentially treated more accurately, I think, in the sense of groups that are attached to their culture and memories and have a living, breathing identity. But on the other hand, the ethnic majority is not treated that way. It's treated as a pathological power-seeking entity. And I think that's just not a consistent approach. I think these groups are largely motivated very similarly. So yeah, that would be my critique, I guess, of the critical race approach, that it's not, and it's also not necessarily easily falsifiable, that in terms of measuring what is power, how do we measure it? How can we falsify an argument that says it's all about cynical power manipulation? It's not, there's no real measures that are offered that we might refute. And so I go through in the book, quite a bit of evidence that would suggest, for example, that, if you take white Americans, white Americans who are very attached to being Italian or Irish, or German or whatever, are way more attached to being white than white Americans who are not attached to those ancestral identities. And it's the same pattern amongst Latinos. If you're very attached to being Cuban or Mexican, you're very attached to being Hispanic, and so on. And so this is sort of a very similar pattern amongst all groups, and it's not it's got very, very little to do with whether you're a Republican or Democrat. That matters a little bit, but it doesn't matter that much. It's not primarily political. I think it is primarily to do with a similar motivation to being attached to an extended family. It's sort of really about a sociological attachment rather than a desire for power. And all the analyses of phenomena like Trump voting and so on will always emphasize it's about whites wanting to hold on to power and dominate. And I think I'm not going to discount that as a motive amongst some, but I think the decline of the familiar, the loss of the familiar attachments is the much larger force. And that's in common with what we see in Europe. And it's simply that loss of that sense of solidarity and attachment of what people knew that is ultimately behind this, rather than that desire for domination, which is typically what is put out as the explanation.
In your book, you talk about the conflict between white traditionalism and left modernism, or you use different terms like ethno-traditionalism and so forth. But I take it you're referring to like the Trump phenomena and QAnon, that kind of thing in America, but also some of the white or racially tinged ethno-nationalist movements in Europe and so forth. This term left modernism is something that I think we're all aware of right here. In my book that I published 2 years ago, I used the term of Nancy Fraser, progressive neoliberalism. Could you talk a little bit more about that distinction between the two groups and how they're, what they really mean and how they're coming to the fore? Is this just an American phenomenon, or is it a Euro-European phenomenon, or say Anglo-European, or is it something that's kind of representative of trends that we have at a global level?
Yeah. Sorry, let me just hang on here. Yeah, I think that it's representative of a Western trend. I mean, the first thing I just want to clarify on ethno-traditionalism, I mean, I draw a distinction between ethno-nationalism, which maybe in Hungary, you know, where you have this idea that only somebody who is white and Christian can be an equal member of the nation, right? So it's about who's in and who's out. And then ethno-traditional nationalism is something that I think is much more common in European countries, where there is a recognition that somebody who's not white or Christian is an equal member of the nation. But it's more a question of maintaining a kind of majority-minority matrix of whatever the historical ethnic composition was, not wanting that to change too greatly. So that's a difference. So the second, ethno-traditional nationalism, does accept minorities as equal members, at least potentially, but doesn't want to see the balance change too quickly within the ethnic balance within a country. But anyhow, I think left modernism, yeah, that is, you mentioned progressive neoliberalism, and I think the way I envision left modernism, it could be progressive neoliberalism, or it could be progressive socialism. You could graft it onto either a capitalist or a Marxist economic philosophy, but it is essentially what I see as the sort of hegemonic ideology in elite institutions in many Western societies, which is that of essentially taking liberal categories such as gender, race, sexuality. So all of the battles that were fought for equal rights for minority groups by liberals, equal treatment under the law, taking those cultural categories and then repurposing or slotting them into a Marxist mode of analysis, which has to do with oppressor versus oppressed, radical transformation through activism, and then moving forth into a new millennium. So that kind of eschatology really applied to the liberal categories. And that's how you get left modernism. Now, what I argue is that this goes back in a way to the 1910s with the young intellectuals in Greenwich Village, New York, and you have it's sort of a bohemian lyrical left that emphasizes cultural radicalism. And this is kind of more the roots of our current left modernist philosophy, which is it's modernist in the sense of rejecting tradition, rejecting religious, national, ethnic tradition of majorities in favor of diversity and cosmopolitanism on the one hand, and then the left side is more to do with redistribution amongst different identity groups of various goods, including economic resources, but also psychological self-esteem. That's more recent. So yeah, I think this is really what we're looking at, the fusion of these two strands, one which is more of a liberal strand, which is which concerns the identity categories rather than class, and the other is the Marxist mode of analysis, of the victim oppressor mode of analysis. And so yeah, that's sort of where left modernism comes from. It spreads greatly with the rise of the university system and television media in the 60s. I don't think a lot of the ideas are new today. I think they're really more or less continuations of the 60s left modernist spin-off, which is really emphasizing race at the top and then gender and sexuality coming sort of second or third as the totemic categories, with a sort of victim oppressor worldview. Now that, as it applies to discourse around, for example, policy areas like crime or immigration or education. So if we take immigration, that would tend to mean that the discussion of immigration levels, particularly reduction, is seen as offensive to one of the totemic categories, and therefore it should be taken off the table of democratic discussion because it is potentially offensive to members of historically marginalized groups, right? So the thinking there is that it's legitimate to infringe upon free speech and democratic discussion if this has a psychologically detrimental effect or perceived psychologically detrimental effect on historically marginalized groups. So what this of course means is then the mainstream parties and institutions cannot have a discussion about the level of immigration that's desired in the population, and that opens space for populist entrepreneurs to exploit that untapped demand. And that sort of explains the emergence of populists on the right, is that you get, like in Sweden, the mainstream parties couldn't really have a discussion about immigration levels. One of the interior ministers tried to do this and was more or less attacked as a racist in the press. The next year, the Sweden Democrats came in on sort of 13% of the vote and eventually reached 25% in the polls. And only then did the mainstream parties then shift and start to talk about, well, what should be the appropriate migration level in Sweden? So it's kind of like a department store only selling one pair of pants in the Soviet Union, and a black marketeer is going to pop up to service the demand that's not being catered to by the mainstream outlets. And that's really what the populist is a kind of political black marketeer that pops up.
Okay. I have a whole bunch of other questions myself. But anybody else want to jump in at this point? I don't want to hog the discussion. It's just as fascinating to me. If you want to type in a question in the discussion, I can read it as well. Josh, do you have something you want to?
No, go ahead. Actually, you actually took my first question, the question you just asked. So go ahead, continue on. I'll come up. I got another idea. So.
Okay. All right. So here, sorry, I'm trying to juggle with my notes here. You talk about ethnic change, and you say it's really about ethnic change, not diversity. I'll read from the book. You say, according to Karen Stenner, a social psychologist, rising diversity triggers two responses: conservatism and authoritarianism. Conservatism involves maintaining continuity with the past and resisting change. If the West was diverse and became more homogeneous, as occurred in Poland or Vienna after 1939, the conservative instinct would be to wax nostalgic about past diversity. ethnic change is the irritant, not the levels of diversity, which is why a meta-analysis of the academic literature that you deal shows ethnic change nearly always predicts increased, increased kind of response or political turmoil and so forth. So I'm wondering if you could kind of unpack that a little bit, elaborate further about why it's not really about diversity, it's about ethnic change, and perhaps what's implied here is the pace of ethnic change. I think one of the problems in talking about this kind of conflict is because you have largely an American audience, and America always looks not only at its own history, which a lot of us don't really have any nuanced understanding of. We tend to buy into one narrative, either the idealistic American exceptionalist narrative, or you might say the anti-exceptionalist, and which increasingly is called by conservatives anti-American narratives and so forth. But again, history doesn't fit in any particular narratives. You would think that because ever since Lyotard, Jean-Francois Lyotard announced the end of grand narratives with his book, The Postmodern Condition in the 1980s, we wouldn't be back there. But we really have this kind of struggle, which I think you addressed a few minutes ago when you were talking about left modernism versus white traditionalism. We really have this kind of war of grand narratives going on, but there are also other narratives that are emerging elsewhere. An example of which I'm very familiar with, because I have a colleague who's very much steeped in this fight, is over Hindutva in India, which is not about whiteness per se, it's about Hinduism and Indian nationalism and so forth. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about this question of change is what's really going on, as opposed to the question of identity and the dominance of white populations. You make a point elsewhere in the book that if you look at the quote Anglo-European sphere, that in fact they are still dominantly white. And even though we're going to see a kind of beiging or turning beige of these populations, it's still, for the most part, in terms of what people perceive, which is what really comes down to about whiteness. But anyway, if you could talk about the pace of change.
Yeah, so this was a study, a meta-analysis I did with another writer called Matt Goodwin, another academic, where we took the literature, I think from the mid-90s to about 2016, where people had done quantitative work on trying to predict immigration attitudes and support for populist right parties. And what you could find is that there was a very consistent relationship where the rate of ethnic change locally, this is at some sort of geographic unit, like a county or city or a ward, or at some level, you could see that whenever you had rapid ethnic change, you almost always had some sort of a increase in anti-immigration sentiment or support for the populist right within an individual. So it seemed like a fairly consistent pattern where change seemed to predict some kind of a backlash. However, when it came to levels, the stock of diversity, what is the percentage of Muslims or African Americans or non-whites, etc., in a given unit, the relationship was more complicated, and it wasn't as straightforward a backlash effect. So there is a process by which people can become used to different levels of diversity over time. So you get a less consistent effect. What I would say is that diversity in a larger unit, like a state or a county or a metro area, tends to produce more of a backlash than diversity in a small unit like your neighborhood. Diversity in your neighborhood tends to be associated with somewhat more tolerant, actually, attitudes to immigration, whereas diversity in your county or metropolitan area has the reverse effect. Not a large effect either way. The other thing I would say is that, going to the Stenner writing on authoritarianism, so she distinguishes these two concepts of status quo conservatism, wanting the present to be like the past, and authoritarianism, which is really about disliking difference and diversity. And they both are, essentially half heritable. If you can see the people who have a messy desk, or who don't think there should be a dress code for tennis tournaments, these sorts of questions that don't have anything to do with migration and diversity, but yet are correlated with views on. So people who prefer that more disorderly environment are actually more accepting of diversity and immigration than those who prefer the more orderly environment. And this is, Jonathan Haidt has done work on this too, with preferences for patterns of dots on screens. And so, yeah, this psychological difference, some people see, they see change as loss. So if we talk about status quo conservatism, change not as exciting, but as a loss. Others see it as exciting. Similarly, with difference and diversity, some see that as disorder, and others as stimulation. And the different psychological responses to this have a high heritable component to them, and it's not a matter simply of education. And Stenner makes that point that if you think you can educate this out of people, you're actually going to get more of a reaction. You've actually got to figure out ways to frame migration in such a way that it doesn't trigger people who prefer that more ordered society. So, for example, talking about immigrants assimilating and leaving the society relatively unchanged is one way of actually reaching those people. And so, yeah, what's happened is, with the rise in diversity and with ethnic change, you're getting very different responses depending upon people's psychological makeup. And that was sort of, Stenner's point, and some other papers have shown this, that you really get a polarization coming out of this process. There was a paper looking at the US, looking at support for deportation versus a path to citizenship, and how much that correlated with partisanship. And there was, in the northern US, up by the Canadian border, where there's much less diversity, there was very little correlation between whether you were a Republican or Democrat and your views. Your views on deportation versus path to citizenship. But down by the Mexican border, it was an enormous correlation. And I think that's just one illustration of the impact, is as you get a more diverse environment with ethnic change, you start to split the electorate more along these psychological lines, which then reconfigures voting patterns as well. And that's what we've also seen. The old class-based voting patterns have largely disintegrated, and increasingly it's these identity-based voting patterns, which are linked to, leaving aside non-white minority groups who have a different pattern. But if you just take the white population, these different orientations correlate very highly with voting for populists. A question like, things in America were better in the past, is an enormous predictor of support for Republicans for Trump, in a way that resentment of elites, feeling that the system doesn't work for you, none of that actually has a very strong predictive power compared to these questions around present was things were better in the past. That is a very powerful predictor.
Great. All right. Anybody else want to jump in? We had a discussion last week in a different context with some people about race in the United States, and I think this is a great opportunity for some people to ask Professor Kaufmann, how he views the American situation. So I was wondering if you might. I know you've talked about it a lot, but I'm wondering if you could just kind of zero in on American politics as you see it, and where you see this as going in terms of the issue of race. I know that's a broad kind of question.
Yeah. Well, I think you've got two strands. I mean, one is the ethnic change, which is more to do with Latin American and other immigration, which is not as connected to the black-white historic issue, which I think there are two separate issues there: the historic black-white issue and the ethnic change, which is more linked to non-black groups. And I think the Trump phenomenon, in my view, is much more an outcome of the latter, of the sort of ethnic change attendant on the rise of the Hispanic population and questions around the border. And in fact, a lot of those Obama-Trump, people who voted for Obama switched to Trump, people in the primaries, you can see that hostility to levels of immigration and to illegal immigration was essential. The main, the strongest factor predicting a Trump vote. But then you also have this historic black-white issue, which has become important since the George Floyd case. Now, it is true that over time, what happened, Obama's election, by bringing an African-American into office, according to some of the political science, it does show that white voters who had this racial resentment of African-Americans who voted Democrat did shift over. And now, but that's been a process that has been occurring election after election since the 1980s. So I don't think that is really that exceptional. I mean, Obama was elected twice, and a lot of the Trump voters, or not a lot, but an important group of them had been Obama voters that switched over to Trump. And I don't think that can easily be explained using the old black-white racial resentment argument. But now, what's happening, of course, in the US, of course, is that since George Floyd, the rise of Black Lives Matter and defund the police, you've seen an incredible partisan polarization. I mean, within the white population, I think white Republicans, it's sort of 85, 86% opposed to Black Lives Matter and only a few percent in support, like 4 or 5%. Amongst white Democrats, it's the reverse. It's like 85-4. So it's sort of the degree of polarization is just, this is the best question you can ask. It's support for Black Lives Matter if you want to pick out party identity. So that's interesting. I mean, where does this go? I mean, there is a battle over a number of things. I mean, one is the American past. To what extent is the U.S. a systemically racist society built on stolen land and all of the rest of it? You see in the surveys about a 50-60 point divide, a 50-point divide amongst white Americans on this point. And so I think, yeah, there is a battle over statues and symbols and the past, whether the U.S. is in a way, whether the 1619 is the founding moment and it's a fallen society that is deeply imbued with, its DNA is racism, and that's the overriding reality of American life, or on the other hand, whether it is essentially a country that has done a lot of good, has a lot to be proud of, but had flaws which it's worked to overcome and which have largely been overcome. And I think that's also where the debate is over how strong are the effects of racism in the present day. So that is a secondary discussion. Certainly the critical race approach, which I think characterizes maybe half of the supporters of the Democrats, would endorse elements of, I think, critical race theory, such as that systemic racism is endemic in US society and so on. But that's very influential in the elite institutions. And so I think there's a battle now over exactly, how racist is the society? Is it still racist? Is this something we want to be teaching in the schools and making the central plank of American identity? It's worth saying, by the way, that actually someone who says that the US is a deeply racist society, and I can't remember which congresswoman said that at the UN, but that can be interpreted actually as a form of American identity. So as a sort of, if your American identity is about the US as a moralistic project of perfectionism, then the fact you are breastfeeding about the sins that you've committed and continue to commit almost suggests that you are this society that is more moral than others because you are more willing to beat yourself up about past and present sins. So it is a certain version, I think, of American national identity. It's just a sort of left modernist moralistic version. And oddly enough, there's a certain pride attached to being so self-critical. And so this is a kind of competing version of American identity to the one that would take pride in the founding fathers and Abraham Lincoln and all of the contributions of American life, which is the more standard and still is the dominant American identity. So I think there's a competition between these competing versions of American identity.
Yeah, and you can call them maybe competing moralisms. I mean, because it's not a revelation. I mean, this goes back to, for example, the political thought of Reinhold Niebuhr in the 1930s. America is very moralistic, and it's got this moralistic reading. We know that, of course, what happened after World War I with Woodrow Wilson and kind of disasters that led to the Weimar Republic and then World War II and so forth, and the League of Nations and the failure of the League of Nations. So the idea that America is moralistic, but what I hear you saying there is that we now have kind of competing moralistic grand narratives that are fighting with each other, but they're still uniquely American. Would that be a fair kind of summation?
I think they're fighting with each other. I'm not sure they're so uniquely American. I mean, here in Canada, for example, the version of that left modernist narrative of Canadian identity centers around, well, we were really awful to the Indigenous and we have to atone, and so our flags are at half-mast and all this. I mean, Trudeau has very much leaned into that. And there's opposition from the Conservatives on that. And in Britain, it would be colonialism and slavery, and so it would all be about knocking down statues that or renaming buildings or teaching new history. So I think it's all a version of the same sort of conflict in each country. Now, you're right, the US had that very universalistic, moralistic strain, more so in New England, I would say, than in the southern states. And that's, of course, become very influential, or had been very influential in the way, in the American exceptionalist narrative. What I would say, though, is that even though you had that American exceptionalist narrative of progress, a kind of Whiggish nationalism, it always shared space with an implicit, more ethnocultural form of national identity around American particularity. And I think that persists. So I argue in the book that it's not simply the American creed of liberal democracy and capitalism, but you also had, this idea of, the landscape, the sports, the everyday aspects of what it means to be American, consumer items, things which might seem trivial, but when you put them together are actually quite important. I think popular culture and also ethnic composition would be part of that. Religious composition would be part of that. So even though the US, you wouldn't necessarily get people saying that America is a Protestant Anglo country, and yet you could certainly see plenty of evidence from the founding fathers, the historians of the 19th century, that this was operating implicitly. So, the critical race theorists aren't entirely wrong that there was an aspect of a more kind of ascriptive Americanism that existed. So you have perhaps these three narratives, the more ascriptive and the more exceptionalist, and then the critical, that exist in various forms over time. And I think those exist in other countries too, it's just in different percentages, really, different proportions.
Great. Okay. That leads into a somewhat provocative question I wanted to ask you about that's in your book, a statement in the section on white guilt. And you say that these kind of, what you're calling white guilt, of course, which has been around for a long time, but referring to the way in which white settlers, everything from the Canadian treatment of Indigenous peoples, and of course the horrible ways in which indigenous people were treated by European settlers. But of course, we know it's not just simply about bad guys and good guys. You know, there was a lot of warfare going on among indigenous peoples, which were exploited also by European settlers. So there's a kind of historical dynamic there. But just say the way we look back at the past right now, in terms of, like, you know, mea culpa, look at all the horrible things we did as Europeans, as settler colonialists, to use that particular term. You call this a form of narcissism. Can you explain that a little better? And what do you mean by that exactly?
Well, I think that what you have is a very selective curation of history. So, as you say, I mean, these focus on these sins, which are real, you know, absolutely, and should be talked about and should be taught, but without putting those into the context of either pre-arrival relations amongst indigenous groups and the way those societies operated, including slavery and genocide and all these conquest, right? Or in the colonial situation, or looking at other empires, looking at, you know, what was happening in Latin America with slavery, what was happening in the Muslim world. You need to have, and also, what about the interactions between indigenous and the Europeans, fusion, hybridities? So the kind of nuances and complexities are really airbrushed out of the story to make it a morality tale that is simple and that's sort of insular, so that it doesn't look in world historical terms. It looks only at a very tiny slice of time and space and tries to draw conclusions that there was an exceptional degree of cruelty, let's say with American slavery or with Canadian treatment of the Aboriginals. Well, any sort of fair-minded view of world history would quickly disabuse that, and you'd realize behind almost every UNESCO World Heritage Site is going to be something pretty awful if you looked at how the sausage was made. So just that sort of more contextualized approach doesn't seem to be there. It just seems to be a very sort of singular, again, you know, asymmetrical multiculturalism. Certain groups are romanticized, the way in which native populations, for example, interacted. You know, we don't hear about West Coast Salish slavery, slave system. We don't hear about very much about the sacrifices of, you know, the burying alive of individuals in pre-colonial African society. You know, these are, and that's not because those societies were awful. I mean, all societies through history have done all kinds of things, but that sort of double standard, if you like, of application of a very different set of moral standards to one set of ancestors compared to another. Yeah, I think this is motivated really by a sort of left modernist search for a usable past. And if it's not there, you almost have to invent it. I mean, in Canada, we had the recent discovery of what were supposedly mass graves of Native children in these residential schools. But of course, there's no actual evidence that these were connected, not connected to a genocide, but it's not even clear who was buried there. Was it only indigenous? Was it also some white kids there? How did they die? Are these simply graveyards whose wooden crosses have decayed over time? What are these? You know, there was no real interest in the nuance of what was discovered with his ground penetrating radar, but rather there was a rush to judgment and no critical pushback in the media on almost on any of this, because in a way this is seen as a sacred event, and the desire to sacralize victims of oppression and to prop up a story of white supremacy, and you know, that just overrode any sort of rational discussion of the nuances.
But go back to the question of narcissism. And this is something that I'm interested in, because I don't know if you've seen my book that came out in 2019 called Neoliberalism, Political Theology from Kant to Identity Politics. But one of the arguments I make there is that the white elites, what, again, I'm using Fraser's terminology, progressive neoliberals, and the whole book is about what we call neoliberals, try to unpack that, what that really means, not just as an economic philosophy, but as a kind of value system that is essentially inherent in the development of the new knowledge classes, the new cosmopolitan classes, who are in many respects transnational and so forth. And there's definitely a way in which these classes, again, I quote a French philosopher, Maurizio Lazzarato, who talks about the university being the kind of center of the new knowledge, elite hegemony, in the same way it was the factory in the Industrial Revolution and so forth. So in some ways, in a lot of ways, this is a way in which racial groups are used, not really, in terms of developing policy to really make their life better, to create these aims of equity, but in a sense justifying the power of the dominant white educated elites against the uneducated white lower classes, in an effort in some ways to not deal with the real question, which you do talk about in this book, of economic inequality.
Yeah, I think you're right that it's a lot more comfortable for Jeff Bezos or a wealthy individual to talk about identity politics and to talk about cultural forms of power and power inequalities, perhaps, than to talk about economic redistribution, which is more threatening to economic interests. Now, what I would say is that I tend to see left modernism and cancel culture and a lot of the things that have flowed from the what I call cultural socialism more recently, this idea of wanting to redistribute self-esteem amongst groups, that I still believe it is more a kind of bottom-up religion. It is more like COVID-19, like a virus, a mental virus that spreads peer-to-peer and spreads on the ground up, than it is about an elite conspiracy. It's not to say that it isn't useful for elites, but I guess I do see it as...
Just interrupt you there. Conspiracy is always a loaded word. And that's going to get lead into my next question, is that you talk about the difference between racial interest and racism, okay? And of course, there'd be a difference between elite interest and elitism, neither of those are what we call conspiracy, because conspiracy implies a kind of self-conscious, effort to try to achieve certain kind of goals. And a lot of this is just, part of history. It's part of demographics. It's part of, political behavior, so to speak. So that's kind of more what I'm interested, that it is the interest of certain white, and use the term cosmopolitan, which in a sense can be a somewhat misleading term because it's used in different ways. But you talk about cosmopolitan elites. That's not my term. That's a term that's very common there. When you're talking about the global society of the people, they're not just jet setters. They don't have to be millionaires, but they essentially see themselves as global citizens as opposed to citizens in a particular country. So that's the kind of class interest that very often, according to some arguments, leverages what claims to be, I don't like the term woke particularly because it's actually a good term in its origins. I mean, it means being conscious of race, but it's now tended to sort of imply, I've got a kind of superiority complex because I have knowledge you don't, almost like I'm Gnostic, so to speak. And so right. So I wonder if you could just talk about how those dynamics are working in terms of racial interests, how race is being codified and defined and configured in terms of the discourse because of these other kind of interests, because everything's now racist, in ways it wasn't even 5 years ago. And we keep extending the meaning of the term.
Yes. So yeah, you're absolutely right that, the way I conceive of it is certain sacred values get elevated so I define woke. I mean, I think woke is a conceptual term that is testable and falsifiable, but it essentially means the sacralization of historically marginalized race, gender, and sexual identity groups. That's the one sentence definition. And once that becomes essentially elevated as the sacred value, a whole other set of actors fall into line, because it then becomes the prestige value which you want to signal, whether you are an elite individual or whether you're a corporation. You want to name check that so that you get the prestige that comes along with having these, what are seen as enlightened, and the most, the highest moral values. And of course, that then distinguishes you from the unwashed who maybe aren't as au fait with these values. And so there is a certain status demarcation that comes along with that, which I think speaks to your point around wanting to differentiate yourself from the lower orders. And I think, I guess it just depends how much we see that as in some way deliberate or not, or, but I definitely think it is seeped into the status system and the status order.
Oh.
And what I think this means then is race. So in my New York Times piece, I was essentially arguing that it wasn't about, it's not as though you have racial division so much in America, but what you have is a division in racial attitudes, largely within the white population. And the polarization is in some way reflecting that. So you have one group who thinks that it's very enlightened to have white guilt and to talk about white supremacy, and then you have another group that says, well, why can't we just treat all groups with respect equally, and not demonize one part of the population? And I think this, I don't particularly feel guilty for my ancestors. I'm proud of what they did. And yes, there were some bad things too. I like other groups and blah, blah, blah. So I think that is really a major division that's opened up. And it does correspond to some degree with class, although I would say this, and that is that, first of all, education level is going to be a stronger. I mean, Thomas Piketty, when he talks about the Brahmin left, I mean, that's his point. Divisions on the basis of income, income is not a great a predictor of whether you voted for Trump or voted for Biden compared to education level. But even education level, something like half, or not quite, but of white Americans with a college degree voted for Trump. So it's not, even education level is not as clean. And even advanced education, I think it was 35% or so voting for Trump, masters and above. And this is where I think that only gets us so far. So I think the elite mass dynamics are feeding into this, but I don't think they are most of the story. I think most of the story is really psychological and ideological, which, amongst the university educated, that divide would be as sharp. So you've got the university educated population who vote for Trump versus those who vote for Biden amongst white Americans. There's a really sharp divide there. In some ways, it's even sharper there than it would be in the working class. And that is fundamentally about beliefs and psychology and ideology. So that's, I think, primary, but the status system kicks in. And then that's one of the reasons why, I think 85% of Yale students are Democrats and only about 6% were Republicans or something. So in certain environments, it's extreme. But generally, I think this is about genuine belief. And then once you have those divisions, the status system just magnifies all of that.
Good. We have a question now from Gabe Parker. It's kind of long, but I'll read it and put it in the chat. And by the way, other people want to put their questions in the chat before you ask them, that's fine. I can either read them, or if you want to ask them directly yourself, that'll put you on camera and you get recorded, it's fine. Otherwise, I can read it. Gabe, do you want to ask the question yourself, or would you like me to ask it?
Yeah, I can talk about it.
Okay.
So I started just saying I love the book, and I agree that there can be like that modern leftist, or not centrist leftist, at least overreaching and condemning like conservatives as racist rather quickly. And I think in your book there was that discussion around cosmopolitanism cosmopolitanism and potentially like a more specific or particular lifestyle. And there was a suggestion there that there's more than one way to live like a good life, and that neither way is necessarily superior to the other. I think that some of the disagreements that we see between these two views can lead to the current discourse in America, where we run into the issue of quick labeled racist or closed-mindedness on one side and the other, especially with topics like critical race theory that are kind of hot words right now. And so I wanted to ask if it's fair to say that your stance on like structural racism in America is that of the unconvinced still, from your interview with Ezra Klein that I listened to. And you talked about like redlining as one example, and that there was more of individual acts of racism rather than the structural, and that there tended to be lacking empirical evidence of that structural racism. And so and that your stance is still being open to being convinced one way or the other.
I mean, my stance on structural racism is that, like any theory, it needs to be measurable and at least potentially falsifiable. I mean, that is sort of Popper's Popperian science. So if you have a theory, if you have a theory which isn't falsifiable, which I think many versions of critical race theory are not falsifiable, really, that essentially what they say is if there's a disparity in a desired social good, like CEOs or income or something, that is ipso facto evidence of systemic racism, pretty much. And that's essentially a circular argument using an outcome to argue for a cause. Now, I do, however, say that there could be structural racism, and how might we think, if we talk about structural racism, which is the idea of racism without individual racists, right? So could we imagine such a thing occurring? And my answer is, well, yes, we could. One example is if you have, let's say, 9 whites for every Black person in an organization, and everybody is equally prejudiced against the other, the Black applicants are going to be hugely disadvantaged because there will be 9 people prejudiced against them versus only 1 person prejudiced against the white applicant. So you have a structural effect there. And so that would be an example of where, if you were to show, okay, there's equal, Blacks who are hiring are equally prejudiced against whites as whites who are hiring. That to me, but look, there's 9 times as many whites, then that to me would be evidence that, okay, the structural effect of this is going to hit the Black applicant much harder than the white applicant, and I would accept a claim of structural racism there. Another example could be where if you did a survey in a police department and people said, well, I'm not racist, but I feel pressure to say racist things around my colleagues, then that would be also evidence of structural racism. So, individuals aren't racist, but they feel structural pressure to perform racism in front of their colleagues. So there are ways in which you could prove this, and they just don't do that. I mean, it's all meta theory, and it's always referencing back to pre-civil rights history, to slavery and Jim Crow, and hey, look, this happened, and therefore, and redlining happened, and there's still inequality today, and therefore there's structural racism. Well, I mean, another way you could do it would be if for example, certain areas were paying more for their insurance, and that couldn't be explained by the property values or the income levels, but only by the racial composition of an area. And that was still the case today, and it was the case during redlining, then that would be evidence of structural racism as well. But it's those careful kind of empirical, taking care to deal with counter arguments, to refute the null hypothesis. That's what I'm looking for before I'm going to accept any theory, including structural racism. And that's what I find to be lacking. And if occasionally you'll see evidence that's presented as structural racism, such as CV studies. But CV studies, of course, would be evidence of individual racism. And I accept that there is some individual racism, and I don't think anyone's denying that. But I think if you're making a claim of structural racism, you need to take into account these aggregate level effects. So that's sort of what I would be looking for. I think there is some there is evidence of, I think it was Roland Fryer who showed that, Black suspects were treated more roughly and more harshly. But, what you'd want is sort of an open discussion where people were allowed to contest with new evidence and say, well, they're treated more roughly, maybe because of the way they address officers. And we can discuss whether officers should just deal with the different ways of being addressed, or, it would contribute to a richer discussion over exactly what's behind some of these phenomena. But yeah, I guess I am currently skeptical, and certainly skeptical of the size of the issue. That's sort of my current position, but I could easily, I could well be convinced, and I have been convinced by some studies, the one by Roland Fryer on roughing up suspects. There was one on administration of pain medication. So there are certain studies that I think are convincing, and I would accept that there are spheres of life where there does appear to be a structural effect, but it is very domain specific. And I think coming up with a sort of sweeping argument about white supremacy or structural racism, in my view, is more ideology than actual science.
Okay. Gabe, I see you said a second chat. Did it answer your question, or do you?
Well,
Yeah, if I did.
Yeah, I guess my example that I was thinking of, or at least that came to my head, was like the war on drugs, and then moving into the prison industrial complex, where you have that huge proportion of the Black population compared to other populations in prison, and that all started a little bit after kind of the civil rights movement, but continued through the 80s, 90s, and so forth. And I don't know if that's too much of a leap, but do you feel like that is an example of structural racism, or like a combination of individual acts from policing unions or reforms and things like that? Or what are your thoughts there?
Well, I think that it's not enough to show a disparate impact. So I'm opposed to this idea that just because there's a disparate impact, would we say that a tax rise is anti-Semitic because Jews are going to be hit harder by a tax increase? I think we need to kind of distinguish between disparate impacts of a policy and the intent behind the policy. I would always sort of look to the intent. Of course, it's also the case that if people realize it's having a disparate impact, that should probably influence their thinking a little bit on whether this is a great idea. The problem with the incarceration is that it was heavily supported by a lot of Black politicians because their neighborhoods were being hit very hard by the drug violence. And now, I guess I would need to see evidence of where sentencing decisions or legislation was motivated by some kind of racial animus before I would see that as structural racism. It's also tricky because to assess the effects, I think that mass incarceration is a bad idea. I'm not a fan of mass incarceration, but at the same time, obviously you need to have safe streets, and the African-American communities would be one of the beneficiaries of having less violence and disorder in their neighborhoods and perhaps in the schools. And so it's important to look at all of the dimensions of the problem. So we're now moving to a situation of experimenting with perhaps less incarceration, and we don't know what the effects are going to be on Black neighborhoods and populations. Is it going to be the case that this is perhaps going to introduce more disorder into these neighborhoods and schools, and therefore impact on their ability to rise out of poverty? Maybe, and we should be open to all of these possibilities, as well as to the possibility that mass incarceration went too far. But the question I guess I would have is, was it the case that Black politicians were complaining and saying this was horrible for our community and that this was negative, but it was pushed by white politicians with some agenda to dominate? I don't know. I guess I think it's a complex problem, and I don't think it's as simple as saying that's structural racism. It may be, in hindsight, have not been the right policy, or it may have turned out to be too far and we need to move the dial back. I think we do, but Yeah, I'm not ready to just say because it had a disparate impact on a certain group in terms of incarceration. I mean, it might have had a beneficial impact in terms of some Black neighborhoods and people being able to rise or have a more ordered environment that allowed them to improve themselves. I don't know. That is an empirical question. But again, the leaping to judgment is not one that I would want to make without. I would like to see some sort of intent-based evidence behind some of the proponents of the policy or the voters for the policy to really call that racism. And it's really tricky when you had a lot of Black support for it. So I guess that's my take on it.
Thank you.
Can I raise a question there that's actually not really talked about in your book? You did sort of allude to it in your response to an earlier question, but that is to talk about as a social scientist, and you are an empirical social scientist. It's clear, you have data for everything you say, and you cite data to make statements and so forth, which is what we call an empirical approach. My own view is that theoretical and the empirical aren't necessarily in conflict with each other, but there is all this tendency that goes back in the history of sociology called grand theory that sometimes pops up or rears its head in a lot of these conversations over that. I don't want to try to unpack that, but you are a social scientist. And very often on these critical conversations, we don't always have social scientists, and social scientists can be very sometimes disconcerting for humanities professors because they actually say, well, this is what the data shows as opposed to what we know is the case. We have this moral intuition and therefore must be the case, but it may not, because history is ambiguous and people's behavior is ambiguous. But that is the term I want to get to, is structural racism. Now, I remember when I was a graduate student in the University of California in Berkeley, back in the late 60s. Yes, I'm that old, I've been around long. I remember when that term emerged, and it emerged primarily among graduate students who were radical activists, particularly connected with the Black Power movement that basically had its genesis during that period. In fact, I remember attending some of the first Black Power rallies, some of which got a little unruly with the cops coming in and breaking them up, and I got caught in the melee. But it was a controversial term then because it was, and I think a lot of historically, genealogically, a lot of the critical race theorists took their calling card from those kind of discussions, i.e. is which the Black Power movement had its ascendancy. It's like, well, the law, civil rights legislation, what we call the sort of moral and juridical order of liberal democracy isn't working. It's being distorted. It's being misused. It's being misapplied. So power rules. And of course, along comes Michel Foucault 15, 20 years later. His theories gradually saturate at least the humanities side of thing. And he talks about power and knowledge. Most scholars focus on the power, but not the understanding of how knowledge works in that. That's something separate. But the question is, it's only now that the term structural racism kind of vanished, and now it's come back and it's become like a meme, among people without examining like critical race theory. How do, for example, 8th graders understand the theoretical writings of Charles Mills, for example, who was the one to kind of reform Marxism and talk about it in terms of race and so forth, where they get this idea. I mean, we just use these things as memes. So I'm wondering, to make a long story short, I'm sounding off myself here. Can you say something about the term? Is it meaningful in any way? To what, if it is, to what degree? If it's not meaningful, what degree is it?
Well, I think there is such a thing as an emergent property. So structural forces, I think, are real. And but I think they are measurable. So I think, I think the meta-theorizing, the neo-Marxist meta-theorizing, critical race theory meta-theorizing tends to assume these shadowy, sweeping power structures, almost like objects barreling through society, these big structures. But very rarely do we get clear definitions of, again, this is the social scientist critique, a clear definition and an operationalization that would allow us to refute counter arguments. Power is not often well defined, and it's not defined in a way that it can be measured. Now, you might say it could be defined as the number of people you can get to do things against their will, in which case we could measure it, but that's not what they do. It's all shadowy, and that's fine. There's a place for meta theory, but at some point you want to try and test that, and in a good faith way that allows for people who say, well, there's nothing there. So, so there's, now, as I said, with structural racism, you could have a situation where one group outnumbers the other heavily. There's the same level of individual level prejudice, but the structural impact hits, because of the disparity of numbers, simply hits one group much harder. That, to my mind, is a structural form of racism. Yes. So it's something that I certainly think is possible, but in the sort of shadowy meta way that it's used in these neo-Marxist theories, I just think it's completely flabby and lacks, empirical verification and substance. And similarly with a definition of racism that says prejudice plus power, to my mind, that's nonsensical from a scientific point of view, because if you did a survey of people, what should happen if you have a concept, what should happen is that someone who scores high in power should score high in prejudice, and vice versa, in order to lump those two things into one concept. Otherwise, you should have two concepts, one which is called dominant group prejudice and the other one which is called subaltern group prejudice, but that's not the way they've decided to go. So really the definition of prejudice plus power is a political definition and is completely a violation of construct validity and internal validity norms within science. So yeah, I think it's largely a sweeping meta theory that lacks a scientific foundation, is the way I would put it. But it's not impossible to prove. So if they did the work, then they could convince me, but that's not there yet.
Okay, yeah, and for example, get to this whole question of whiteness and what does it mean? You say, and again, I've got your Kindle version of your book, so it just gives location numbers, not page numbers, but it says, you say our wider Latin American country is more unequal. And then you show a chart and says, again, you said this figure 7.9 again shows no relationship. Racial inequality is at rock bottom in the most non-white Dominican Republic, but it is also bad in pale-skinned Uruguay. Diverse Panama and whiter Chile or Costa Rica both score well. So, I mean, there's a case of you're saying, well, the data doesn't show that inequality and whiteness or the dominance or lack of dominance of white skins or the perception of white skin really has that much to do with inequality, which of course is one of the big issues or one of the big claims of structural racist theories. That is that the dominant of white populations tend to lead to dominant economic inequality. So I was wondering if you could talk maybe a little bit about that data that you cite in the chart, which I don't have in front of me, but I've got the quote.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that's right. And that holds it amongst US states as well, by the way. So you have some US states which are very white, which have high black-white inequality, and some very white states which have low black-white inequality. So there's no relationship, and it's kind of if you look at the theory of whiteness and the critical race people, it is essentially that, well, whites are trying to maintain a demographic dominance, and then that allows them to maintain economic dominance. So what we should see is places where their whites are a larger share and more dominant, therefore there should be higher racial inequality, and we don't find that. There's no relationship which really suggests it's utterly orthogonal and irrelevant or fairly irrelevant to the distribution of income. Yeah, and I just think this is, again, the narrative also suggests that, well, once whites are no longer in power, no longer in a majority, boy, we're going to have racial equality. And this data would say, well, actually, it's going to make no difference whatsoever to the income levels between white and black. And so it's just to say that it's not really about power, because these theories are mesmerized by power as the overriding explanation for everything. And actually, it may be that in many cases, power has almost nothing to do with the explanation. And maybe it is to do with a lot of other factors: historical, cultural, economic policies. There may be a whole other set of reasons why you see disparities. And those disparities change over time. The Irish used to be poorer than the British in England, and then that's no longer the case. So these things, white ethnics in America used to be poorer than WASPs, and that stopped around 1980. So these things change over time, and power is not really, I don't think, a good explanation for why these things change over time. But yet that is almost taken for granted and never challenged in a lot of the sociology and writing around this, that it's just assumed that somehow larger demographic share is about power, that this is what drives the system of unfairness. And I guess I just don't think that's been adequately challenged and tested and defended from criticism, partly because it's very difficult to mount criticisms of these theories without being branded in some way a racist or ostracized if you challenge these narratives. So there's not really viewpoint diversity and open inquiry in these fields, I'm afraid.
Let me ask you a personal question, if I can, and then we'll let somebody else follow up with that. So have you been branded that? I mean, I've read some stuff on the internet, which doesn't mean anything, because I look at my Wikipedia thing to see, how people think of what you do. But have you been accused of sort of being kind of crypto racist or enabling racists, by these not so standard orthodox left modernist arguments?
Yeah. I mean, routinely, and of course, even being, half Jewish and part Chinese and part Latino doesn't insulate you from that. So, I mean, they'll go after you no matter what. But yeah, there are, the people who are strong believers in this ideology are quite ruthless. There are a number of, not all of them, sorry, I should say a small minority of them are very ruthless. They will try and smear you. They will put pressure on your institution, formal complaints, open letters. They will try and kind of infiltrate committees, ethics committees, you name it, to try and sort of either stop your research, smear your reputation, get you in trouble, try to get you fired. Yeah, that's happened multiple times. I think, what I would say in Britain, we have a quite a supportive press and government right now. I mean, the Conservative government have a very comfortable majority and are unlikely to be unseated for some time. And they've kind of, something I've been involved with the government is this academic freedom bill, which puts in place a very robust set of protections against certainly job loss, certainly. So there's a lot more, and the press is very quick to, I'd say, hold universities to account when they try on some of these tactics. So I think it's a better environment than in the US or in much of the US, although I gather at state level things might be improving in some places. But I think at least legally, there is that backup. But that doesn't mean, it's very unsettling, of course, when people are trying to get at your students and get at your colleagues, and they can put a lot of pressure on you. So, and they know that. And so they'll try and do that. And essentially, they are reasonably successful in getting people to eventually leave a position due to that kind of pressure. Yeah. So that's a reality, I think, for a lot of anyone who's dissents on this front is going to get a lot of this. And it's just a question of whether you're willing to put up with it or not.
Are you willing to put up with it?
Well, for now.
Okay. All right. Well, good. Listen, somebody was starting to ask a question here just before who was that?
That was me. Yeah, I just want to jump in real quick. Yeah, Dr. Kaufmann, I loved what you said with the power thing, and it's Foucault has dominated the social sciences since his arrival. He's the most quoted author in social sciences, from what I heard, and so this is what I appreciate. Number one, I've been, a fan since Shall the Religious Inherit the Earth. I had the opportunity to work with the most brilliant demographer, Vegard Skidbeck, and that was a wonderful time. And at any rate, what was so great about that work, and with what I appreciate with the continuity with Whiteshift here, which is another excellent work, is your take on cultural theory. And I see what you're trying to do. They're trying to bring it all down to power, but you're shifting the analysis to culture, which is what you did in Shall the Religious Inherit the Earth. You talked about values and culture, and you linked the data to that. And I love this engaging with Daniel Bell. I'm a huge Daniel Bell fan, Glazer, the New York intellectuals, and I don't know why we're not talking more about their work. We really need to recover their work. And I know you had the opportunity to spend time with Daniel Bell. You said he was still sharp as nails at the end of his tenure there. I just wanted to get basically just your perspective on your methodology, because I'd say I align myself with your critique, and I think the culture is important. I also had the opportunity to study with Olivier Roy at the EY. And he had his take on holy ignorance. I read your review on holy ignorance, and he had this position about religion and culture parting ways. It's a very unique take, and I had a lot of fun working with that theory, right? But I know you had some criticisms about that, and I guess I just want to hear more about your methodology, your theory on culture, since this is, after all, linked to JCRT, Journal of Culture and Religious Theory. I'm just very intrigued by it, because that's what I find so novel and intellectually stimulating about your work. And so could you, I don't know, just tell us more about this whole cultural theory in the line of the Daniel Bell, which is the his whole, you talked about the media and how that translates into popular culture. So yeah, please.
Well, thanks for the kind words, Joshua. Yeah, I mean, Bell is he's one of my heroes, and I think his writing on modernist culture, really, this idea that we've changed to a culture of anti-traditionalism, and that permeates the arts, and it permeates universities, and it's one of the powerful forces in modern life. Yeah, I think that my view is that because a lot of academics and intellectuals, they almost take it for granted that this culture exists without having to explain it, and they therefore miss how powerful it is in continuing to drive a lot of the changes in society. So my view on culture is that it is, I mean, it's clearly a set of external practices, but also the subjectivity, the attachment to symbol and myth and memory, and that I think has a lot of independent causal force in society, apart from economic self-interest and or institutional or power dynamics. So I've kind of always thought of culture as being an independent variable that is extremely important and neglected in a lot of, not all, of course, there is Ronald Inglehart and Pippa Norris on Culture Shift, which I think is great work, even if I'm not 100% agreeing with everything, but I think There are some writers who take culture seriously, but somehow in terms of the social theories that are popular, it's generally about power, or maybe it's about the older Marxist material drivers or rational choice or something. But I think, yeah, the cultural, and of course my doctoral supervisor, Anthony D. Smith, who's a theorist of nationalism, who came up with the ethno-symbolic theory of nationalism, and he's a very important writer as well. And he's kind of, his argument is always that people try and explain nationalism as just the instrumental interests of elites and or the functional needs of modern states, but that this is, in fact, doesn't correspond with a lot of the evidence we have on the ground that people feel passionately, and that it's these cultural attachments and motivations which are often very important in explaining these phenomena, and that people aren't just blank slates that can be written on by elites and whose view of the world, you can't just change Americans into Frenchmen in an afternoon by telling them they're French. I mean, so that sort of idea that the culture is, has this rootedness in certain societal institutions and myth symbol complexes that don't change necessarily that rapidly over time. So yeah, it's a sort of Durkheimian social fact analysis. So that's kind of my view, and I think that's often underplayed in explaining some of these development. And then also these cultures have a kind of logic that unfolds. So it might have been that you were about cultural equality mixed with anti-traditionalism, and so you favored a cosmopolitan open borders Americanism back in 1916 or 1917, but then that philosophy will then expand and unfold. So maybe we haven't thought about gays or trans or other things, but those will somehow, in a way, be logical extensions of the theory, which then has to keep innovating to stay fresh. And so a lot of the kind of new developments I would see as a sort of unfolding of these logics, cultural logics, rather than, oh, it's just because of social media, or it's just because of, but of course, university expansion and social media are going to play a big role. So it's not to say those things don't matter or that capitalism doesn't matter, but it's also to say that I think these ideas have a certain internal logic that unfolds over time. Yeah.
Right. Which you showed well over in the how it plays into fertility rates with the religious, carrying over these cultural values for higher fertility rates and the secular values.
Right.
Right. Yeah. That's okay. That's great. Just what's your take on extending the media thesis of Daniel Bell? You just said now social media. I mean, I just get the sense that when Daniel Bell wrote that, I mean, what we had was television and some movie theaters, but now we have iPhone 24/7. Is this like what do you think this would be? Let's to use the word acceleration. Would this be some sort of acceleration of Daniel Bell's thesis to a speed of cultural influence? Because that this is just kind of unthinkable what we have now when Daniel Bell wrote his books, right? His works. Do you think that this would? How do you think this would? What do you think the future looks like in this trickling down the values and playing this rough spot, playing this divide between the populist and the cosmopolitans?
Well, I don't think that the rise of the internet explains the development. I mean, left modernism, I think, was already developing many of the features we see today before the internet age. And you can go back, I mean, not only to, Carl was mentioning Berkeley in the 60s with the, if you look at the black studies, they basically occupy buildings and strike until they get, the demands, which include hiring 50 black professors and black stuff. So you had that sort of cultural radicalism going on in the 60s. You had cancellation of people who were talking about the role of genes, and then in the 70s, Steven Pinker talks about that. You had in the 90s, the early 90s, I mean, you had all kinds of episodes. I mean, there's one here in the University in British Columbia where the political science department, 1995, was shut down and there was some outside investigator called in to investigate claims of racism and sexism, but there were no individuals that were accused. It was just general. And the person came in, the whole thing was a performative exercise, but very, very similar to what we see now. So I don't think the ideas are that different. I mean, there are a few innovations like trans and jazz hands and a few other microaggressions. Yeah, there are some innovations. I just don't think, now, so what does the advent of clickbait journalism and social media do? Well, I do think it does accelerate, yes. And it does mean that more of these, what Cass Sunstein would call these outrage entrepreneurs or norm entrepreneurs, are able to flourish and get their message out and feed off each other. Now, and so that does then create more flash mobbing. It creates more of, it allows, cancel culture existed already, but it simply speeds it up and allows for a scaling up. So I think it's a quantitative expansion, not a qualitative change that occurs with social media. Now, the other thing too, of course, it empowers the anti-woke IDW side, which arguably would have had a tougher time were it not for the internet. So it's not that it's just singular. I mean, you have multiple effects, but it is also the case that there's no doubt that if you look at the so-called Great Awakening, as Matthew Iglesias describes it and Zach Goldberg writes about, in the data, you definitely see 2014, 15, 16, this huge shift to the left in cultural attitudes amongst white Americans who are liberal, especially very liberal. And that definitely is, the timing of that, the chronology of that is very much in line with the expansion of Twitter and of clickbait journalism. And so I think you can definitely say that the fact the New York Times is using the terms racism and white supremacy, or the Washington Post, or all of these outlets, that sort of spikes around 2014, 15, 16. There's no question that Twitter is influencing that, and that the new kind of outrage journalism is influencing that. So yes, my answer is I think it's mainly a scale quantitative effect rather than really affecting the ideas too much.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Kaufmann.
Thanks. Well, thank you. We've got a few more minutes, but if does anybody else have any questions? Now's your time. Comments, pushbacks. We're not.
Yeah, I had a question. So first of all, you're one of the few people out there that I think have come to so many of the same conclusions I have, and you're actually out there publishing. So, thanks a lot for doing all of that. So I had a question. I heard once, I think in a interview you were doing, or a podcast maybe, that you thought that one of the solutions, or a potential solution, or maybe the solution to this kind of cultural resistance to challenging orthodoxy is more government intervention in the academy. And so, these are things that I talk about. I kind of am more interested in issues of gender and questions of, falsifiability of things like patriarchy. And then, even like on cultural levels, like the demand to interpret the Venus of Windledorf as a fertility icon that shows that women were, they were preferred to have obese women and blah, blah, blah. It's like there's no evidence of any of that at all. And so I think and then a couple years ago, once COVID started, I actually got into epidemiological research, and the startling, well, I guess it wasn't that frightening since it's already in that world, but you see that all of these huge names in all the related fields are getting censored and sidebarred and canceled. I think one of them being the possibly, or at least arguably, the most cited scientist in human history, Nobel laureates, biophysicists, scientists extraordinaire, all of them, their posts removed from social media, of lectureships canceled, things like that. So a lot of this was not without government acceptance. So I'm wondering if government becomes implicit or complicit in cancel culture, etc. Do you still think that government intervention is the way to go with rectifying things?
Right. Very good questions, and thanks for your comments. Yeah, I guess I really do, and this is why. I mean, I see the society as a sort of three-level structure with government, institutions, and citizens, and so the threat to liberty and reason can come from government. Maybe if we're talking about Turkey or China, historically that's often been the case, but it can also come from those elite institutions. And I think that's the situation we find ourselves in the West. Is it's large corporations and universities and publishing houses and various other elite institutions that are engaging in suppression of free expression. And so the question then is, how do you change that? Now, of course, yes, long term we have to change the culture and move back to what Greg Lukianoff would call free speech culture that supports a set of laws and institutions that are open to dissent. But the long run could be very long. And I think that in a democracy, the government, which is based on a process of election and scrutiny, is a much more, it's much more open and transparent and open to criticism than institutions are, who operate behind closed doors. And that in a situation where you have illiberalism coming out of the middle layer, you do need the government to actually step in, to actually reform, to regulate. So what I should say is regulate in accordance with the law. So they are upholding the law as it has been developed through precedent, through common law. And so, for example, if universities are violating academics' right to freedom of expression, which they do all the time, then to my mind, it is absolutely right that governments have a role to step in and prevent them from doing that. Now, this is for state-run, publicly funded universities. Private universities is different. If it's not in receipt of government funds, then they can do what they like, and they can be religious, they can be woke, they can be whatever they want. But I think for the state-funded sector, there's absolutely a role for government to essentially regulate universities to ensure that they uphold the law on academic freedom. And essentially the universities have been interpreting the law the way they see fit to prioritize other goals, such as racial equality, group equality, such as the university's reputation, over the rights of academics to have their freedom, and justifying that. Usually they don't even have to justify it legally. They just get away with it because nobody challenges them. You can't have people suing, though, because if you try and it is so costly and time consuming. If you rely on a reactive methodology like lawsuits, I don't think it's ever going to work, because the silencing and the chilling effects, which is the heart of the problem here, will continue. Only if you have proactive governments enforcing that law proactively will academics feel the confidence to be able to, will some of that chilling lift. And that's one of the reasons I'm in favor of that. With regard to tech, I should say, the reason I'm in favor of regulation on the tech side is because these are natural monopolies and common carriers, and therefore should fall, in my view, under antitrust sort of regulate. I think it's justifiable to regulate them. What I would like to see is simply the algorithms made public, and also the fact that and that if there is political bias or other kinds of bias going on in those algorithms, that's sort of where you would regulate. I mean, I'm also in favor of adding political creed to protected characteristics, because I think if you essentially allow political discrimination in firing and hiring and so on, I think this is also something I'm opposed to. I think it's legitimate in a civil rights framework to have that. Now, of course, you could get a government that is all in on speech suppression, but I think that's going to be open, and that's going to be, people are going to see that in the press, and they can vote on that. they can't vote on universities' policies and tech companies' policies. And so therefore, I think this is why I think that, and I also think that this authoritarianism is emergent out of institutions, that governments don't have to do anything. A kind of, let us say, a left modernist government, they don't actually have to do anything. They just allow their shock troops in the institutions to carry these policies forward. And so even if they simply stand aside, that's all they need to do. So it's almost all upside for those who would want to regulate these institutions. And in my view, there is almost no downside. Now, of course, if we get very intrusive hate speech laws where you're throwing people in jail, I mean, that's a problem. But then, that problem would arise anyway. And I think that's where the electorate will be apprised of that. And they can say, no, we don't want this policy, and we're going to vote against you because you're going to bring in these new kinds of policies.
What about if the electorate wants those policies? Because I think that might be kind of something that we're seeing.
Well, I think that so what I talk about with the government regulation is it is with the grain of existing constitutional law, if you like, the precedents of common law that have developed over decades and decades. Really what I'm in favor of is proactive application of the law as it's developed. And so now if you had a government that violated people's individual rights, which I think is going to happen in Canada, by the way, well, may happen. So the government pushes in these very nebulous hate speech laws, same in Scotland, by the way, then they should be challenged in the courts, and the courts should look at, in the Canadian case, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and to say, well, this is inconsistent with the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. So I do think, that body of classical liberal precedent that's built up over time in liberal societies can be a bulwark. But of course, yes, a determined government who managed to get their judges, activist judges in, who may decide, oh no, saying trans women aren't women is hate speech, and yes, that's justifiable. I mean, you can obviously if you get those people into the judiciary, they can render rulings, but of course they'll then be out of step with counterparts in other countries. The hope is that the judicial would be the bulwark against the state if it really went overboard. But whether that's durable, I don't know.
Okay, great. We're out of time now, and this has been fascinating, and thank you. I encourage everybody to get the book if you haven't read it. It's a deep read, and there's a lot of information and a lot of data, and it doesn't necessarily fit an ideological point of view. It's very anti-ideological on both sides. So we want to thank you, Eric, very much for this, and this will be up on the web, and we'll have a transcript to go with it. And so bring everybody in for the future into these conversations. So one last quick 1 minute comment you want to make?
No, just to thank Joshua and Carl and everybody for your excellent questions and such a stimulating discussion. I really enjoyed it, and keep it up.
Thank you, Dr. Kaufmann. It's an honor to have you.
Thank you very much. Okay.
Okay.
All right.
Cheers. Thank you.
Sure.